Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So I just wanted to get into this. I wanted to start off by saying um, hello and thanks for your support, or at least having a listening ear. And so this has been on my mind for quite some time. So I know some people may not be familiar with this, but I feel a lot of this, um, that back and forth, the gender wars between males and females in the Black community specifically, and this is what this report is about. I feel like there's been a lot of things that have happened, or a lot of subjects, a lot of topics, a lot of talks that have taken place outside of Black thought, or Black intervention, or Black people who can try to make sense of some of this. Some people have now, probably even back then, there were some people who tried to, um, strategize on how to make things better. But the problem I have with a lot of these reports, they come from people who are white. And stereotypically, um, white people who had not had to deal with struggles the same as African American people or Black people have had to deal with, usually see things from a different lens. And a lot of times when they make these reports out of biases and stereotypes. And they already have preconceived ideas of other races of people. And so what they'll do is they'll think and they'll strategize all of the different ideas and with their biases, and they'll put together lengthy reports. And pretty much those reports, they're read by different scholars, different individuals, and they strategize and then they agree as to a consensus if these reports, or these findings rather, are valid. And so a lot of times, things that people have experienced, or maybe they've seen uprisings, you know, um, what they would call like poverty and blight in ghettos and whatever that they claim is destroying neighborhoods or destroying families, or the nuclear families in the Black culture. They'll make reports about it. And so they'll have sometimes people that'll go to houses, social workers, and different things like that, and they'll see the problems and all of the result of situations that sometimes are out of people's control. But what they do is they often leave out the circumstances that cause people to get in those situations. And so they leave a lot out of these reports, and they just pretty much demonize the individuals that are suffering in these communities. And then they leave a lot out of these reports as well, because a lot of what they leave out is a system that has been put in place to pretty much cause some of the failures that people have experienced in different cultures, because they've been shut out of opportunities as other people have been given opportunities. And so I thought of this report for quite some time. I'd say maybe a month or two or more. And so I read the report to its entirety. So this is a lengthy video, but what I'm going to say is that I wanted to make that mention of all of that, in my opinion, first and foremost. So within what I'm reading, I'm probably going to make some opinions. But I will say this, that there are some realities in some of what is in the reports, things that really are going on or have went on in the past. And so what my problem is with this is that it had painted a picture of the Black female stereotypically as being doomed raising her children alone. And a lot of it too is coming from a male perspective. So there's a lot of sexism in this as well, you would say, because it doesn't give female input. It basically paints that picture. And so you see what year it's coming from. It's 1965. So it's called the Moynihan report. And so it paints this bleak picture of what they would call the Negro family. So you already see from hearing that you're going to see who the original writer was of this report. And so you're going to get an idea that a lot of this is coming from, I'll just be honest with you, a lot of it was coming from a white guy. And he painted this picture of the Negro family as pretty much being doomed because of poverty. And some people were in agreement with this, and then others felt like there were some things that were truth. And then other people were extremely highly offended by these reports because what it did was it stereotyped Black families. And it pretty much put women in a position where you were almost predestined to be single, because of all of the systems that were set up. If you read about some of the things that were put in place, which is still today, where you get mass incarceration and then you have, limited opportunities for education at that time. And then there were really bad situations where you couldn't live in other neighborhoods. Even if you could afford to live in other neighborhoods, you were shut out of neighborhoods. So you had to be kind of pushed in neighborhoods where you were with other people of color. And so they leave a lot of that out. And so this right here, it may seem really offensive to people, but this was coming in a time in 1965. And so some of these individuals today probably are still around, or they remember this. And you even got Black people who are, scholarly, so what, that believe in some of this. And so that's where you get sometimes individuals who kind of, they'll be a Black person, but they have the same ideologies as somebody that's white, that, they've, paint pictures of the Black nuclear. There is no family, structure. And they pretty much too demonize Black females, and it's coming from a sexist point of view. And a lot of these opinions that they have are put in these reports. And so you kind of got to read between the lines. But anyway, without further ado, it says the Negro Family, the Case for National Action, Office of Policy, Planning, and Research, United States Department of Labor. And so these were things that were actually set in stone, so to speak. So they did an analysis, sort of an assessment, as you would, on the Black family, which they back then called the Negro family. So 200 years ago in 1765, 9 assembled colonies first joined together and demand freedom from arbitrary power. So for the first century, we struggled to hold together the first continental union of democracy in the history of man. So 100 years ago in 1865, following a terrible test of blood and fire, the compact of the union was finally sealed. And so they'll go back in history and they'll talk about all of the things that shape America and, their theologies and all of this. And you even have the president back then. It was President Lyndon B. Johnson who was pretty much stating this. And so it says, for a second century, we labored to establish a unity of purpose and interest among the many groups which make up the American community. So that struggle has often brought pain and violence, and it is not yet over. State of the Union message of President Lyndon B. Johnson, January 4th, 1965. Okay. And so in March of 1965, you had this Policy Planning and Research, United States Department of Labor, that put this case for the national action based on the Negro family. So the United States is approaching a new crisis in race relations. So all of these things that you're hearing now and that you're seeing, and when people are talking about race, it is nothing new. It has happened way back when, even when all of us weren't even here. Some of us were in diapers. So in the decade that began with the school desegregation decision of the Supreme Court and ended with the passage of Civil Rights Act of 1964, the demand of the Negro Americans for full recognition of their civil rights was finally met. The effort, no matter how savage and brutal, of some state and local governments to thwart the exercise of those rights is doomed. So the nation will not put up with it, least of all the Negroes. So the present moment will pass. So in the meantime, a new period's beginning. So in this new period, the expectation of the Negro Americans will go beyond the civil rights. So being Americans, they will now expect that in the near future, equal opportunities for them as a group will produce roughly equal results as compared with other groups. So this is not going to happen, nor will it happen for generations to come unless a new and special effort is made. So already they were setting up a picture that the Negro family was doomed unless they had some kind of action plan in place. There are two reasons. First, the racist virus in the American bloodstream still afflicts us. So Negroes will encounter serious personal prejudice for at least another generation. Really, it's actually still going on. So second, 3 centuries of sometimes unimaginable mistreatment have taken their toll on the Negro people. So the harsh fact is that as a group, at the present time, in terms of the ability to win out in the competitions of American life, they are not equal to most of those groups with which they will be competing. Okay? So that's basically what race is. Competing. You're competing for homes, for good schooling, to have recognition in society, to be able to live where you want to live and to be treated as equal. So individually, Negro Americans reach the highest peaks of achievement, but collectively in a spectrum of American ethnic and religious and regional groups, where some get plenty and some get none, where some send 80% of their children to college and others pull them out of school at the 8th grade, Negroes are among the weakest. So the most difficult fact for white Americans to understand is that in these terms, the circumstance of the Negro American community in recent years has probably been getting worse, not better. So indices of dollars of income, standards of living, and years of education deceive. The gap between the Negro and most of their groups in American society is widening. So this report was back in 1965, and they were saying that back then. So the fundamental problem in which this is most clearly the case is that of the family structure, the evidence, not final, but powerfully pervasive, or persuasive, that is that the Negro family in the urban ghettos is crumbling. A middle class group has managed to save itself, but for vast numbers of the unskilled, poorly educated city working class, the fabric of the conventional social relationships have all but disintegrated. There are indications that the situation may have been arrested in the past few years, but the general post-war trend is unmistakable. So long as this situation persists, the cycle of poverty and disadvantage will continue to repeat itself. The thesis of this paper is that these events in combination confront the nation with a new kind of problem. Measures that have worked in the past or would work for most groups in the present will not work here. A national effort is required that will give a unity of purpose to many activities of the federal government in this area directed to a new kind of national goal, the establishment of a stable Negro family structure. But this would be a new departure for federal policy and a difficult one, but it almost certainly offers the only possibility of resolving in our time what is, after all, the nation's oldest and most intransigent and now its most dangerous social problem. What Gunnar Myrdal said in An American Dilemma remains true today. America is free to choose whether the Negro shall remain her liability or become her opportunity. And so there's the Negro American Revolution, the Negro American family, the roots of the problem and the tangle of pathology, and what is the case for national action. So it comes in 5 parts. That's the table of contents. And so basically, it's quite a read. So it goes on. Chapter 1, the Negro American Revolution is rightly regarded as the most important domestic event of the post-war period in the United States. So nothing like it has occurred since the upheavals of 1930s, which led to the organization of the great industrial trade unions, and which in turn profoundly altered both the economy and the political scene. There have been few other events in our history, and the American Revolution itself, the surge of Jacksonian democracy in the 1830s, the abolitionist movement and the populist movement in the 19th century, comparable to the current Negro movement. There has been none more important. The Negro American Revolution holds forth the prospect that the American Republic, which at birth was flawed by the institution of the Negro slavery, and which throughout its history has been marred by the unequal treatment of Negro citizens, will at last redeem the full promise of the Declaration of Independence. So although the Negro leadership has conducted itself with the strictest propriety, acting always and only as American citizens asserting their rights within the framework of the American political system, it is no less clear that the movement was profound international implications. So it was in no way a matter of chance that the nonviolent tactics of philosophy of the movement, as it began in the South, were consciously adapted from the techniques by which the Congress Party undertook to free the Indian nation from British colonial rule. So it was not a matter of chance that the Negro movement caught fire in America at just that moment when the nations of Africa were gaining their freedom, nor is it merely incidental that the world should have fastened its attention on events in the United States at a time when the possibility that the nations of the world will divide along color lines seems suddenly not only possible, but even imminent. Such racist views have made progress within the Negro American community itself, which can hardly be expected to be immune to a virus that is an epidemic in the white community. The Black Muslim doctrines, based on total alienation from the white world, exert a powerful influence. So on the far left, the traction of Chinese communism can no longer be ignored. So it is clear that what happens in America is being taken as a sign of what can or must happen in the world at large. The course of the world events will be profoundly affected by the success or failure of the Negro American Revolution in seeking the peaceful assimilation of the races in the United States. So the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Dr. Martin Luther King was as much an expression of the hope for the future as it was recognition for the past achievements. So it is no less clear that carrying this revolution forward to a successful conclusion is a first priority confronting the great society, the end of the beginning. So the major events of the onset of the Negro Revolution are now behind us. The political events were 3. First, the Negroes themselves organized as a mass movement, and the organizations have been in some ways better disciplined and better led than any in our history. So they have established an unprecedented alliance with religious groups throughout the nation and have maintained close ties with both political parties and with most segments of the trade union movement. Second, the Kennedy-Johnson administration committed the federal government to the cause of Negro equality. So this had never happened before. Third, the 1964 presidential election was practically a referendum on this commitment. So If these terms were terms made by the opposition, they were in effect accepted by the president. So overwhelmingly, victory of the President Johnson must be taken as empathetic, popular endorsement of the unmistakable and openly avowed course which the federal government has pursued under his leadership. So the administrative events were threefold as well. So first, beginning the establishment of President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunities and on the enactment of the Manpower Development and the Training Act of 1962. So the federal government has launched a major national effort to redress the profound imbalance between the economic position of the Negro citizens and the rest of the nation that derives primarily from their unequal position in the labor market. So second, the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 began a major national effort to abolish poverty, a condition in which almost half of the Negro families are living. Third, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 marked the end of the era of legal and formal discrimination against Negroes and created important new machinery for combating covert discrimination and unequal treatment. So the act does not guarantee an end to harassment in matters such as voter registration, which we hear about that even today still, but doesn't make it more or less incumbent upon government to take further steps to thwart such efforts when they do occur. So the legal events were no less specific, beginning with Brown versus our Board of Education 1954 through the decade that culminated in recent decisions upholding the Title II of the Civil Rights Act. The federal judiciary, led by the Supreme Court, was used every opportunity to combat unequal treatment of Negro citizens. So it may be put as a general proposition that the laws of the United States now look upon any such treatment as obnoxious, and that the courts will strike it down wherever it appears. So the demand for equality. With these events behind us, the nation now faces a different set of challenges, which may prove more difficult to meet, if only because they cannot be cast as concrete propositions of right and wrong. The fundamental problem here is that the Negro Revolution, like the industrial upheaval of the 1930s, is a movement for equality as well as for liberty. So liberty and equality are the twin ideas of the American democracy. So, but they are not the same thing, nor, most importantly, are they equally attractive to all groups at any given time, nor yet are they always compatible one with the other. So many persons who would gladly die for liberty are appalled by the equality. Okay, so that would coincide with why some people feel that, and I'm adding this in here, that they are not going to say the Pledge of Allegiance because you may have that liberty, but you're not getting equal rights. So they're appalled by the equality because there is no equality for certain races of individuals, specifically Negro people at the time, and even today, which is now coined as African American. So many whom are devoted to equality are puzzled and even troubled by the liberty as well. So much of the political history of the American nation can be seen as a competition between these two ideas as, for example, the unending troubles between capital and labor. So by and large, liberty has been the idea with the higher social prestige in America. So it has been the middle class aspiration par excellence. So note that the assertions of the conservative right that R is a republic, not a democracy. So equally, on the other hand, has enjoyed tolerance more than acceptance. And so, yet, it has roots deep in a Western civilization and is at least coeval with, if not prior to, liberty in the history of the Western political thought. So American democracy has not always been successful in maintaining a balance between these two ideas, and notably, so were the Negro American is concerned. So Lincoln freed the slaves, but they were given liberty, not equality. Okay, so there's a difference. So it was therefore possible in the century that followed to deprive their descendants of much of the liberty as well. So the idea of equality does not ordain that all persons end up as well as they start out equal. So in the traditional terms as put by Faulkner, there is no such thing as equality per se, but only equality too. Equality right, an opportunity to make the best one can of one's life within one's capability without fear of injustice or oppression or threat of violence. But the evolution of the American politics with the distinct persistence of the ethnic and religious groups has added a profoundly significant new dimension to the egalitarian ideal. So it is increasingly demanded that the distribution of the success and the failure within one group be roughly comparable to that within other groups. It is not enough that all individuals start out on even terms. So if the members of one group almost invariably end up well to the fore, and those of another far to the rear, this is what ethnic politics are all about in America. And in the main, the Negro American demands are being put forth in this now traditional and established framework. Here, a point of semantics must be grasped. So the demand for equality of opportunity has been generally perceived by white Americans as the demand for liberty and a demand not to be excluded from the competitions of life. At the polling place, in the scholarship examination, at the personnel office, on the housing market issues as well. In order to get a vote, so I'm basically breaking it down, to be able to have the freedom to vote, to be able to have the freedom to earn a proper education, and to be able to get good jobs or careers, and to also be able to compete in the housing market, and to be able to have an opportunity to get a home loan. So liberty does, of course, demand that everyone be free or try his luck or test his skill in such manners, but these opportunities do not necessarily produce equality. So on the contrary, to the extent that the winners imply losers, equality of opportunity almost ensures inequality of results. So the point of the semantics is that equality of the opportunity now has a different meaning for Negroes than it has for whites. So it is, or at least no longer a demand for liberty alone, but also for the equality. So in terms of a group result. So in Bayard's, Rustin's terms, it is now concerned not merely with removing the barriers to the full opportunity, but with achieving the fact of equality. For by equality, Rustin means a distribution of achievements among Negroes roughly comparable to that among whites. So Nathan Glazer has put it, so these are different philosophers or different people that they have their take on these issues. And so every now and then you'll hear a name of a person and it's put in these reports. So Nathan Glazer has put it, the demand for economic equality is now that the demand for equality opportunities and equality qualified. So it is now the demand for equality of economic results. And so that demand for equality in education has also become a demand for equality of results and of outcomes. Enforcement, they bring about an objective that is an end in itself. Example, e.g., or whatever the Public Accommodations titles, the Civil Rights Act. So other provisions are at once terminal and intermediary. So the portions of the Civil Rights Act dealing with the voting rights will no doubt lead to further enlargements of the freedom of the Negro America. So, but by and large, the programs that have been enacted in the first phase of the Negro Revolution, manpower retaining the job corps, community action, only make opportunities available. And so they cannot ensure that the outcomes are going to be there. And so why I'm reading this is to tell you that even back in the days before we were all born, a lot of these issues that you're hearing about have come about and they have tried to strategize on it. So when you see all these people on YouTube that are talking about all these strategies and what Black people need to do and all this kind of stuff, do you know white people were doing this? And that's the reason why some of us are in the mess that we're in now. And it doesn't make it any better by seeing some of these Black YouTubers that are on here and they're collecting money for feel-good speeches, and they're not really helping anybody. So what they're not doing is they're not telling people that these things have already come to fruition. There have been people that have strategized on these issues long before they were even in diapers. And so where is the result of this? Where are we at now? And so I just want you to think about that. So it goes on to say that, but by and large, the programs that have been enacted in the first phase of the Negro Revolution, manpower, retraining, the Job Corps, if you've heard of those programs, community action, they only make an opportunity available, but they cannot ensure the outcomes of what's going to happen with that. So the principal challenge of the next phase of the Negro Revolution is to make certain that equality of results will not follow, okay? So if we do not, there will be no social peace in the United States for generations to come, which is where we're at right now. So the prospect for equality. The time, therefore, is at hand for an unflinching look at the present potential Negro Americans to move from where they are now or to where they want or where they ought to be. So there is no very satisfactory way at present to measure social health and social pathology within the ethnic and the religious or the geographical community. So data are few and uncertain. The conclusions drawn from them, including the conclusions that follow, are subject to the grossest error. Nonetheless, the opportunities are no less than the dangers of the present moment demand that an assessment be made. Okay. So back then in the days they were making their assessments, they were writing their notes, they were strategizing, they were having think tanks, they were having people back then have roundtable meetings on what to do with the Negro family. And so this is nothing new. So a lot of these people, some of these people are scammers on here. They don't care what happens because they know it's not going to work because somebody did it way before they were in diapers and it didn't work then. And so a lot of times what's the problem is that people usually put labels on individuals and they set up their demise. But see, what they're leaving out of a lot of these reports, there's social systems in place that help to foster the demise of individuals. You know, you have all of these programs, and they're supposed to be temporary programs to help you get out of your poverty. But a lot of time people fall prey to these programs, not only because of the programs being in existence, you know, such as welfare and food stamps, which are supposed to be temporary aid to families or to needy families. But what happens is if you have systems in place that shut you out of housing, that shut you out of job opportunities, that you go to subpar schools, you have to blame that as well. So they don't put everything in the pot, and they don't explain to you that there's a lot of racist systems that are set in place to pretty much put people in a position where they have to be long-term dependent on these programs. And so they blame the people rather than the structure that's put in place. That's the reason why people are fighting right now for, you know, Brett Kavanaugh to not be elected as part of the SCOTUS, because he can make laws based on his biases. They're looking at paperwork right now to see what kind of things that he was in agreement with, what he wrote about, some of the things that he, you know, that he might have had personal views on, if it was abortion, if it was, you know, whatever laws, because they can make the laws. So sometimes people that we see, that you see all these people and they do this racism stuff and it's like evident and you can take photos of them. There's some people that you don't take photos of. You just see them in the news every day and they talk about them. But people, they don't understand. They can actually do damage with the paper and pen, or with it nowadays, what do you call that? Computer. They can type laws. They can put things in effect that affect a whole race of people and put you in a disadvantage. And so Then you have all these, people who are scholarly individuals who have all this education and know-how, but they already harbor their own bias. And so they put together these reports, like lengthy reports like this, pretty much examining the demise of certain races of people. And so some of it is evident that these things are going to happen because they're in these positions. But what they fail to do is they fail to put in what systems they're living under that put them in these conditions. And so that's what I'm pretty much reiterating about this. But this report was put together many, many years ago. And so it pretty much it set the tone for what was to come for the Black community. And so family is part of a structure of how, people are going to thrive from generations to come. So if you break apart that family structure by putting in place different, systems that create less of a foundation or a stable foundation, then you slowly break apart that family unit. Therefore, it causes a lot of problems from the futures to come. And so it goes on to read about some of the things that happen in some of these neighborhoods. And I got to warn you that some people find these reports extremely offensive because of the tone and the language and some of the things that they pretty much lay out. It's like pretty much they foreseen the destruction of the Black family in these reports. And so they listed out, they approach it in one way where they say we got to do a plan of action to help these people, but then they pretty much list out the demise of people. And you got to know that the people that are doing this are they there to help? Are they just there to kind of much put the blueprint on the destructiveness that they've put in these systems in place to set up the Black family as not being able to have opportunities and equality in America? And so he goes on to say that there is no very satisfactory way at present to measure social health and social pathology within the ethnic or the religious or the geographical community. Data are few and uncertain, and the conclusions drawn from them, including the conclusions that follow, are subject to the grossest error. Nonetheless, the opportunities no less than the dangers of the present moment demand that an assessment be made. So that being the case, it has to be said that there is considerably body of evidence to support the conclusion that the Negro social structure, in particular the Negro family, battered and harassed by discrimination, injustice, and uprooting, is in the deepest trouble. So while many young Negroes are moving ahead to the unprecedented levels of achievement, many more are falling further and further behind. So after an intensive study of the life of the Central Harlem, the board of directors of Harlem Youth Opportunities Unlimited, Inc. summed up their findings in one statement: massive deterioration of the fabric of society and its institutions. So it is a conclusion of this survey of the available national data that what is true of Central Harlem can be said to be true of the Negro American world in general. If this is so, it is the single most important social fact in the United States today. As much as possible, the statistics used in this paper refer to the Negroes. Okay, it refers to Negroes. However, certain data series are available only in terms of the white and non-white populations. So, where this is the case, the non-white data have been used as if they were referred only to Negroes. Okay. So this necessarily introduces some inaccuracies, but it does not appear to produce any significant distortion. So 1960, Negroes were 92.1% of all non-whites. So the remaining 7.9% is made up of largely Indian, Japanese, and Chinese. And so the combined male unemployment rates of these groups is lower than that of the Negroes. So in matters relating to family stability, their husbands are absent for other reasons. The comparable figure for Indians, 14%, Japanese 7%, and Chinese 6%. Therefore, the statistics of non-white generally understate the degree of the disorganization of the Negro family and the underemployment of Negro men. So the Negro American family. At the heart of the deterioration of the fabric of the Negro society is the deterioration of the Negro family. So this sounds very negative, but this is a report that was done to study Black people and their family structure. So it is the fundamental source of the weakness of the Negro community at the present time. So there's probably no single fact of the Negro American life so little understood by whites. Okay, so the Negro situation is commonly perceived by whites in terms of the visible manifestation of discrimination and poverty, in the part because Negro protest is directed against such obstacles, and in part, no doubt, because these are facts which involve the actions and attitudes of the white community as well. And so it is more difficult, however, for the whites to perceive the effect of the 3 centuries of exploitation that have had on the fabric of the Negro society itself. So here, the consequences of the historic injustices done to Negro Americans are silent and hidden from view. And so that is a fact that a lot of things have been put in place to pretty much set up the demise of Black people, as in general, because of racism and because of societal structures that have been put out to pretty much set up the demise. You know, we have, you know, the mass incarceration issues, and then we have, you know, what they call the human Negro communities that they called back then human blight. So, but here is where the true injury has occurred. Unless this damage is repaired, all of the effort to end discrimination and poverty and injustice will come too little. So the role of the family in shaping character and ability is pervasive as to be easily overlooked. The family is the basic social unit of American life. It is the basic socializing unit. So by and large, adult conduct in society is learned as a child. And so this is when they get into the crux of everything. So a fundamental insight of the psychoanalytical theory, for example, is that the child learns a way of looking at life in his earlier years, through all of which later he experiences and view, which profoundly shapes his adult conduct. So it may be hazarded that the reason family structure does not loom larger in public discussion and social issues is that people tend to assume that the nature of the family life is all about the same throughout American society. So the mass media and the development of suburbia have created an image of the American family as highly standardized phenomenon. So it is therefore easy to assume that whatever is that makes the differences among individuals or groups of individuals, it is not a different family structure. So there is much truth to this. So as with any other nation, Americans are producing a recognizable family structure, but the process is not completed by any means. So there are still, for example, important differences in family patterns surviving from the age of the great European migration of the United States. And these variations account for notably differences in progress and assimilation of various ethnic and religious groups. So a number of immigrant groups were characterized by usually strong family bonds. So these groups have characteristically progressed more rapidly than others. But there is one truly great discontinuity in family structure in the United States at the present time, that between the white world in general and the Negro American. So the white family has achieved a high degree of stability and is maintaining this stability. By contrast, the family structure in the lower class Negroes is highly unstable, and in many urban centers is approaching complete breakdown. So there is considerable evidence that the Negro community is in fact divided between a stable middle class group that is steadily growing stronger and more successful, and increasingly disorganized and disadvantaged lower class group. There are indications, for example, the middle class Negro family puts a higher premium on family stability and conserving of family resources that does the white middle class family. So the discussion of this paper is not obviously directed to the first group, excepting as it is affected by experiences of the second, an important exception. So this is going on, talking about the tangible pathology. So there are 2 points to be noted in the context. So first, the emergence of the increasing visibility of the Negro middle class may beguile the nation into supposing that the circumstances of the remainder of the Negro community are equally prosperous, whereas just the opposite of this is true at present and is likely to continue so. So second, lumping of all Negroes together in one statistical measurement very probably conceals the extent of the disorganization among the lower class group. So if conditions are improving for one of the, and the deteriorating for the other, improving for one and deteriorating for the other, the result statistically averages might show no change. So further, the statistics on the Negro family and most other subjects treated in this paper refer to a specific point in time. They are a vertical measure of the situation at a given movement. And so they do not measure the experience of the individuals over time. So thus the average monthly unemployment rate of the Negro males for 1964 is record at 9% and are recorded at 9%. But during the 1964, some of the 29% of the Negro males were unemployed at one time or another. So similarly, for example, if 36% of the Negro children are living in broken homes at any specific moment, it is likely that a far higher proportion of Negro children find themselves in a situation at one time or another in their lives. So nearly a quarter of urban Negro marriages are dissolved. So they're already setting up the whole line of generations of what is to come throughout this assessment. So nearly a quarter of Negro women living in cities who have ever married are divorced, separated, or living apart from their husbands. The rates are at highest in the urban Northeast, where 26% of the Negro women ever married are divorced, separated, or have their husbands absent. So on the urban frontier, the proportion of husbands absent is higher. In New York City in 1960, it was 30.2%, not including divorces. So among the ever married non-white women in the nation, the proportion with husbands present declined in every age group over the decades of 1950 to 1960 as follows. Chart not reproduced. So although similar declines occurred among white females, the proportion of white husbands present never dropped below 90%, except for the first and the last age group. So nearly 1/4 of the Negro births are now illegitimate. So both white and Negro illegitimacy rates have been increasing. Okay, so they also make mention of the white family as well. So a lot of times they would leave out reports of other families and what their problems were. So the white rate was 2% in 1940, but it was 3.7% in 1963. But in the period that the Negro rate went from 16.8% to 23.6%. So the number of illegitimate children were 1,000 live births increased by 11 among whites in the period of 1940 to 1963. And so, but by 68 among non-whites. So there are, of course, limits to the dependability of these statistics. So there are almost certainly a considerable number of Negro children who, although technically illegitimate, are in fact the offspring of a stable union. So on the other hand, it may be assumed that many births that are in fact illegitimate are recorded otherwise. So probably the two opposite effects cancel each other out. And so on the urban frontier, the non-white illegitimacy rates are usually higher than the national average, and the increase of the late has been drastic. So in the District of Columbia, the illegitimacy rate of non-whites grew from 21.8% in 1950 to 29.5% in 1964. So a similar picture of the disintegration of Negro marriages emerges from the divorce statistics. So divorce has increased of late for both non-whites and for both whites and non-whites, but at a much greater rate for the latter. Okay, so in 1940, both groups had a divorce rate of 2.2%. By 1964, the white rate had risen to 3.6%, but the non-white rate had reached 5.1%, so 40% greater than the formerly equal white rate. So almost one-fourth of the Negro families are headed by females. And so, as a direct result of the high rate of divorce and separation and desertion, of a very large percent of Negro families are headed by females. So, while the percentage of the such families among whites has been dropping since 1940, it has been rising among Negroes. So, the percent of non-white families headed by females is more than doubled now. The percent than the percent for the whites. So farther less, non-white families increased by a sixth between 1950 and 1960, but held constant for white families. So it has been estimated that only a minority of Negro children reach the age of 18 having lived with their all their lives with both of their parents. And so once again, this measure is a family disorganization is found to be diminishing among white families and increasing among Negro families. So the breakdown of the Negro family has led to a startling increase in welfare dependency. So the majority of Negro children receive public assistance under AFDC programs at one point or another in their childhood. So at present, 14% of Negro children are receiving AFDC assistance against 2% of white children. So 8% of the white children receive such assistance at some time in their lives as against 56% of the non-white children, according to an extrapolation based on the Hugh data. So let it be noted that, however, that out of the total of 1.8 million of non-white illegitimate children of the nation in 1961, 1.3 million were not receiving aid under AFDC program, although a substantial number have or will receive aid at some time in their lives. So again, the situation may be said to be worsening. So AFDC programs, welfare, SNAP, what they call it today, deriving from the long established Mother's Aid programs, was established in 1935, principally to care for widows and orphans, along with the legislation covered all children in homes deprived of parental support because of one or both of the parents are absent or incapacitated. So in the beginning of the number of AFDC families in which father was absent because of the desertion was less than a third of the total. So today it is 2/3. Hugh estimates that between 2/3 and 3/4 of the 50% increase 1948 to 1955 in the number of absent father families receiving ADC or AFDC rather, may be explained by the increase in broken homes in the population. And so 1960 study of aid, which is AFDC, aid to dependent children in Cook County, Illinois, stated that a typical AFDC mother in Cook County was married and had children by her husband who desertion. His whereabouts are unknown and he does not contribute to the support of his children, and she is not free to remarry and has an illegitimate child since her husband left. Almost 90% of AFDC families are Negro. And so the steady expansion of the welfare programs that were happening back then as a public assistance programs in general can be taken as a measure of the steady disintegration of the Negro family structure over the past generation in the United States. So 3, the roots of the problem, slavery. Okay, so they dig in here and they go back as far as slavery and how that helped to foster all of these issues. So the most perplexing question about American slavery, which has never been altogether explained, and which indeed most Americans hardly know exists, has been stated that Nathan Glazer as follows: why the American slavery, the most awful and the world has ever known. The only thing that can be said with certainty is that this is true. It was. So American slavery was profoundly different from and is its lasting effects on individuals and their children indescribably worse than any recorded servitude, ancient or modern. The peculiar nature of the American slavery was noted by Alexis de Tocqueville or Tocqueville and others, but it was not until 1948 that Frank Tannenbaum A South American specialist pointed to the striking differences between Brazilian and American slavery. So, the feudal Catholic society of Brazil had a legal and religious tradition which accorded the slave a place as a human being in hierarchy of society, a luckless, miserable place to be sure, but a place withal. In contrast, there was nothing in tradition of English law or Protestant theology which could accommodate to the fact of human bondage. The slaves were therefore reduced to a status of chattels, often, no doubt, well cared for, even privileged chattels, but chattels nevertheless, which is almost like we would view as like an animal. So Glazier also focused on the Brazil-United States comparison continues. Okay, so the Brazil and in Brazil, the slave had many more rights than in the U.S. in the United States, and he could legally marry, and he could. Indeed, he had to be baptized and become a member of the Catholic Church. So his family could not be broken up for sale, and he had many days on which he could either rest or earn money to buy his freedom. So the government encouraged manumission, and so the freedom of infants could often be purchased for a small sum of the baptismal font. So, in short, Brazilian slaves knew that he was a man, not an animal, and that he differed in degree, but not in kind, from his master. So, in the United States, the slave was totally removed from the protection of organization society, compared to elaborate provisions for the protection of slaves in the Bible. So his existence as a human being was given no recognition at all by any religious or secular agency. He was totally ignorant and completely cut off from his past, and he was offered absolutely no hope for his future. So his children could be sold, his marriage was not recognizable, and his wife could be violated, in such as I've done in a previous video, how white men who were slave masters would rape women even if they were married. And if they were slave women and they had a husband and they were married to another slave male, they could be violated, they could be raped, they would use them to make more babies so they could have more slaves to work fields and whatnot. So they could be violated, they could be sold, or there was something comic about calling the woman with whom the master permitted him to live a wife. Some women were also used as concubines as well. And he could also be subject without redress to frightful barbarities. And so there were presumably as many sadists among slave owners, men and women alike, as there were in other groups. And so slaves could not, by law, they weren't taught to read or write, and they could not practice any religion without the permission of their masters, and they could never meet with his fellows or religious or at any purposes except in the presence of white people or company. And finally, if a master wished to free him, every legal obstacle was used to thwart such that action. And so this was not what slavery meant in the ancient world, in medieval and in early modern Europe, and in Brazil and the West Indies. So it was a lot different, viewed a lot different in those areas, in those countries. So more important, American slavery was also awful in its effects. And so if we compared the present situation of American Negro with that of, let us say, Brazilian Negroes who were slaves 20 years longer, we begin to suspect that the differences are the result of very different patterns of slavery. Today, Brazilian Negroes are Brazilians, and though most are poor and do the hard and dirty work of the country, as the Negroes do in the U.S., they are not cut off from society. They reach into its highest strata, merging there in smaller and smaller numbers, it is true, but with complete acceptance with other Brazilians of all kinds. And so the relations between Negroes and whites in Brazil show nothing of the mass irrationality that prevails in this country. And so Stanley M. Elkins, drawing on the apparent behavior of the prisoners in the Nazi concentration camps drew the elaborate parallel between the two institutions, and the thesis has been summarized as follows by Thomas Pettigrew. So both were closed systems with little chance of manumission, emphasis on survival, and a single omnipresent authority. So the profound personality change created by Nazi internment camps also has independently reported by a number of psychologists and psychiatrists who survived was towards childlessness and total acceptance. Childishness and total acceptance of SS guards as father figures, a syndrome strikingly similar to the Sambo caricature of the Southern slave. So 19th century racists readily believed that the Sambo personality was simply an inborn racial type. And so yet no African anthropological data have ever shown any personality type resembling Sambo, and the concentration camps molded an equivalent personality pattern in a wide variety of Caucasian prisoners. So nor was Sambo merely a product of slavery in abstract, for the less devastating Latin American system never developed such a type. And so we're, as in Black people or African American, as they coin us, have had characters called the Sambo that have depicted Blacks as being inferior or having no, they don't have any power in this country, and basically they're at the mercy of, who basically runs the country, which are white. And so extending this line and reasoning, psychologists point out that slavery in all its forms sharply lowered the need for achievement in slaves, Negroes in bondage, and stripped them of their African heritages, were placed in completely dependent roles. And so that's pretty much what the Sambo character is. He's dependent on the white man's say in society, and pretty much also he's he will do and say and jump. If they say jump, how high, and he's like, how high. And so that's kind of give a clue. It's put in a, that light. And also he looks at the white man as being the savior. And so all of the rewards came not from individual initiatives and enterprise, but from absolute obedience. Okay, a situation that severely depresses the need for achievement among all people. So most important, all slavery vitiated family life. So since many slave owners neither fostered Christian marriage among their slave couples, nor hesitated to separate them out of auction blocks, the slave household often developed a fatherless, matriarchal, mother-centered pattern. And so it began right there. And so that is what we are experiencing today. And so everybody has pretty much put a bad label on the Black family and pretty much fostered that throughout American society. And so the Reconstruction, with the emancipation of the slaves, the Negro American family began to form in the United States on a widespread scale, but it did so in a atmosphere markedly different from that of which produced the white American family. So the Negro was given liberty, but not equality. So life remained hazardous and marginal. So of the greatest importance, the Negro male, particularly in the South, became an object of intense hostility and attitude unquestionably based in some measure of fear. So when Jim Crow was in effect, it made its appearance towards the end of the 19th century, and it may be speculated that it was the Negro male who was most humiliated, thereby the male was more likely to use public facilities, which rapidly became segregated. Once the process began, and as just the important segregation and the submissiveness it enacts, it's surely more destructive to the male than to the female personality, keeping the Negro in his place, and can be translated as keeping the Negro male in his place, and the female was not a threat to anyone at all because she's female. So unquestionably, these events worked against the emergence of the strong father figure, basically to break the males down so that they have to be in a place of submissiveness and know that the person of all persons that's in charge is the white man in American society. So the very essence of the male animal, from the bantam rooster to the four-star general, is to strut. Indeed, 19th century America, a particular type of exaggerated male boastfulness became almost a national style. Okay, so not for the Negro male. A sassy nigger was lynched. So, in other words, if you had pride as a black man, and if you held your head up high, even in the Jim Crow eras, you could possibly be viewed as that sassy Negro or sassy nigger, and you needed to be put in your place. You needed to be lynched. And so, in this situation, the Negro family made little progress toward the middle class pattern of present time. Margaret Mead has pointed out that while in every known human society everywhere in the world, the young male learns that when he grows up, one of the things he must do in order to be a full member of society is to provide food and shelter, of course, some female and her young. Okay, and this pattern is not immutable. However, it can be broken even through it has always eventually reasserted itself. So within the family, each new generation, the young male learns the appropriate nurturing behavior and superimposed upon their biological given maleness. This learned parental role. And so he's supposed to be looked at and viewed as the provider. But what if you're doing all these things, putting all these rules and all these things in American society like Jim Crow to segregate and to pretty much break the black male down? What do you think is going to happen to that family structure? And so I want to add that in there. So when the family breaks down, okay, as it does under slavery, under certain forms of indentured labor and serfdom, periods of extreme social unrest during wars, revolutions, famines, epidemics, or in periods of abrupt transition from the one type of economy to another. So this delicate line of transmission is broken. So men may be a founder badly in these periods, during which the primary unit may again become mother and child, and biologically given the special conditions under which man has held his social traditions and trusts are violated and distorted. And so Franklin Frazier makes clear that at the time of emancipation, Negro women were already accustomed to playing the dominant role in the family and marriage relations, and that the role persisted in decades in rural life that followed urbanization. So country life and city life are profoundly much different. And so gradual shift of American society from the rural to urban basis over the past century and a half has caused abundant strains, many of which are still much in evidence. So when this shift occurs suddenly, drastically, in one or two generations, the effect is immensely disruptive of traditional social patterns. So it was the abrupt transition that produced the wild Irish slums. So a lot of people like to say this: Irish, they were slaves, but they were indentured servants. So there was a lot different. So it breaks this down in 19th century Northeast: drunkenness, crime, corruption, discrimination, family disorganization, juvenile delinquency were the routine of that era in Irish slums. So in our town, our own time, the same sudden transition produced the Negro slums. So which but hardly better than its predecessors, fundamentally the result of the same process. So Negroes are now more urbanized than whites. And so notice that most of the housing, what they're doing is a lot of white people there was white flight. They moved to the suburbs to get away from black people and from Hispanic people and all of that, and people that were considered non-whites. And now they're trying to move back into the urbanized communities, and they've priced up all of the apartments and all of the housing, and the market rate has gone up, but they don't have enough production of units. And so they're trying to get, because of wages are pretty much like where they were before. We have people that are working relatively credible work, but they're not making the wages enough to live, the livable wage to live in these urban cities. And so a lot of people are being pushed further out. And so Negroes, it goes on to say that, are now more urbanized than whites. And so this is in this getting closer to this time. So Negro families in the cities are more frequent, headed by women and those in the country. Okay. So the difference between the white and the Negro proportions of families headed by a woman is greater in the city than in the country. So the promise of the city has far been denied the majority of Negro migrants, and most particularly the Negro family. So in 1939, Franklin Frazier described its plight movingly in that part of the Negro family entitled "In the City of what they call the City of Destruction." And so the impact of hundreds of thousands of rural Southern Negroes upon Northern metropolitan communities present a bewildering spectacle. So striking contrast in the levels of civilization and economic well-being among these newcomers to modern civilization seem to baffle any attempt to discover order and direction of their mode of life. So in many cases, of course, the dissolution of the simple family organization has begun before the family reaches the northern cities. So, but if the family have managed to preserve their integrity until they reach the northern city, poverty, ignorance, and color force them to seek homes in deteriorated slums, which they coined the ghettos, or slum areas, which practically all institutional life has disappeared. So hence, at the same time that these simple rural families are losing their internal cohesion, they are being freed from the controlling force of public opinion, communal institutions, and family desertion among Negroes in cities appears then to be one of the inevitable consequences of the impact of urban life on the simple family organization of the folk culture, which Negroes has evolved in the rural South. And so the distribution of desertion in the relation to the general economic and cultural organization of the Negro communities that have grown up in the America cities shows a striking manner of influence of selective factors in the process of adjustment to the urbanized environment. So Frazier concluded his classic study, The Negro Family, with the prophecy that the travail of civilization is not yet ended. So first, it appears that the family, which evolved within the isolated world of the Negro folk, will become increasingly disorganized. So modern means of communication will break down the isolation of the world of the Black folk. And so as long as the bankrupt system of the Southern agriculture exists, Negro families will continue to seek a living in towns and cities and countries. And so they will crowd the slums areas and southern cities to make their way to the northern cities, where their family life will become disrupted and their poverty will force them to depend on the charities. And so in every index of the family pathology, divorce, separation, desertion, family-led houses, our female family-led houses, children in broken homes, and illegitimacy, the contrast between the urban and rural environment of the Negro families is unmistakable. And so Harlem, into which Negroes began to move early in the centuries, is a center of symbol of urban life. Negro Americans. Conditions in Harlem's are not worse than they are probably better than in the Negro ghettos. So the social disorganization of the central Harlem, comprising of 10 health areas, thoroughly documented. HARU report is what it was called, save for the illegitimacy rates. These have now been made available to the Labor Department of New York City Department of Health, and there could hardly be a more dramatic demonstration of the crumbling and the breaking of the family structure of the urban frontier. And so unemployment and poverty, that's an issue. So the impact of unemployment on the Negro family, and particularly the Negro male, is at least understood of all the development that have contributed to the persistent crisis. So there is a little analysis because there has been almost no inquiry. So unemployment for whites and non-whites alike has on the whole been treated as an economic phenomenon, which almost no attention paid for in at least a quarter of a century to the social and personal consequences. So in 1940, Edward uh, White Bake is his name, described the effects of unemployment on the family structure in terms of 6 stages adjustment. So, although the families studied were white, the pattern would clearly seem to be a general one and applied to the Negro families as well. So, the first 2 stages end with the exhaustion of credit and entry of the wife into the labor force. And so the father is no longer the provider, and the elder children become resentful. And so the third stage of the critical one is commencing a new day to day existence. At this point, the 2 women are in charge. And so consider the fact that the relief investigators of the caseworkers are normally women and deal with the household. So already suffering a loss in prestige and authority in the family because of the family or the failure to be the chief breadwinner. So the male head of the family feels deeply this obvious transfer of planning for the family's well-being to 2 women, one of them an outsider. His role is reduced to that of an errand boy to the form of the relief office. And so that kind of sounds sexist, but anyway, in family, it makes it through its stage. Bake finds that it is likely to survive, and the rest of the process is one adjustment. The critical element of adjustment was not welfare payments, but work. Having observed the families under conditions of unemployment with no public help, or with that help coming from from the work relief, and from the work relief are conceived of unemployment with no public help, or with the help coming from direct. Okay. Assistance, which can restore our strained bonds of family relationship in a way which promises the continued function of that family in the meeting of the responsibilities that are imposed upon it by our culture. So work is precisely the one thing that the Negro family had in the such circumstances has not received over the past generation. So the fundamental overwhelming impact of that Negro unemployment, with exception of the few years during the World War II and the Korean War, has continued at a disaster levels for 35 years. Again, once again, this is particularly the case of the northern urban areas in which Negro population has been moving. So in 1930, the census taken in the spring before the Depression was in full swing showed Negro unemployment at 6.1%, as 6.6% for whites, but taking out the South reversed the relationship, white 7.4% and non-white 11.5%. And by 1940, the 2-and-1 white Negro unemployment relationship that persists to this day had clearly emerged. So taking out the South again, whites were 14.8% and non-whites 29.7%. Since 1929, the Negro worker has been tremendously affected by the movements of the business cycle and of unemployment. So he has been hit worse by declines than whites, and proportionately helped more by recoveries. Okay, so this is where they get all of these things. When white people hear welfare and unemployment, they think of black folks. And so 1951 to 1963, the level of Negro male unemployment was on a long run rising trend, while at the same time following the short run ups and downs of the business cycle. So during the same period, the number of broken families in the Negro world was also on a long run rise with intermediate ups and downs. A glance at a chart not reproduced on page 22 reveals that the series move in the same directions. And so up and down together with the long run rising trend, but the peaks through troughs are 1 year out a phase. So this unemployment peaks 1 year before the broken families and so on. By plotting these series in terms of the deviation from trend and moving the unemployment curve 1 year ahead, we see the clear relation of the two otherwise seemingly unrelated series of events. Cyclical swings of unemployment have their counterpart in increases and decreases and separations. Okay, so the effect of recession, unemployment, and divorces further illustrates the economic roots of the problem. So non-white divorce rates dipped slightly in high unemployment years like 1954 to 1955, 1958, and 1961 to 1962. And so divorce is expensive, and those without money resort to separation or desertion. And so, while divorce is not a desirable goal for the society, it is an institution of the family that has been so recognized. Okay. No, wait a minute. Okay. So, okay. Divorce is expensive, so those without money resort to the separation and desertion. So that's where they get, like, where Black men, they're in a home, they're married, but divorce is expensive, so they just rather separate, or they'll divorce and they'll go away somewhere else, live, make another family somewhere else, or they'll just be, out and about, bachelor or so-called bachelor, when they're really not. They're still married. They hadn't finalized the divorce, so divorce is not a desirable goal for the society, but it is recognized the importance of the marriage and family, and for children in some family continuity and support is more likely when the institution of the family has been so recognized. So the conclusion from these and similar data is difficult to avoid. So during times and when jobs were reasonably plentiful, although at no time during the period, save perhaps the first 2 years, did the unemployment rate of the Negro males drop to anything like a reasonable level. So the Negro family became stronger and more stable. And so as jobs became more and more difficult to find, the stability of the family became more and more difficult to maintain. So what they're saying is that when a man, he's not able to find work, or there's some kind of impede in finding stability in order to feed his family and to maintain the family structure, then the family maintenance is going to be difficult, and the stability of the family is going to be much more difficult. So the relation is clearly seen in terms of illegitimacy rates of census tracts in the District of Columbia compared with male unemployment rates in the same neighborhoods. So in 1963, they did this, a prosperous year, 29.2% of all Negro men in the labor force were unemployed at some time during the year. So almost half of these men were out of work 15 weeks or more. So the impact of poverty on the Negro family structure is no less obvious. So although it may not be widely acknowledged, so there would seem to be an American tradition, agrarian in its origins, but reinforced by the attitudes of urban immigrant groups to the effect that family mortality, or morality actually, so stability and decline as income social position rise. So over the years, this may have provided some of the consolation to the poor, but there is little evidence that it is true. So on the contrary, the higher family incomes are unmistakably associated with greater family stability, which comes first may be a matter of conjecture, but the conjunction of the two characteristics is unmistakable. So the Negro family is no exception. In the District of Columbia, for example, census tracts with median incomes over 8,000 had an illegitimacy rate to 1/3 that of the tracts of the categories that lived under 4,000 per year. And so the wage system, so the American wage system is conspicuous in the degree to which it provides high incomes for individuals, but rarely adjusted to ensure that the family as well as the individual needs are met. So almost without exception, the social welfare and social insurance systems, other industrial democracies provide some adjustment or supplement to workers' income to provide extra expenses to those with families, but American arrangements do not save for income tax deductions. So federal minimum wage at $1.25 per the hour provides a basic income for the individual. but an income well below the poverty line for a couple, much less a family with children. So in 1965, economic reports, the president revised the data on the number of persons living in poverty in the United States to take account of the varying needs of families of different sizes rather than using a flat cutoff of 3,000 income level. And so the resulting revision illustrated the significance of the family size. So using these criterions, the number of the poor families is smaller, but the number of the large families who are poor increases, and the number of the children in poverty rises by more than one third. And so the 11 million to 15 million. And so this means that one fourth of the nation's children that live in families that are poor, what they were saying. So a third of these children belong to families in which the father was not present. But the unemployed was employed the year round. So in overall, the terms of median family income is lower for larger families than for small families. And so families with 6 or more children, median incomes 24% below families with 3. So it may be added that 47% of the young men who fail the selective service education tests come from families with 6 or more family parties. And so during the 1950 to the 1960 decade, the heavy Negro migration in the cities of the North and the West, the ratio of non-white to the white family incomes in the cities increased by 57 to 63%. And so corresponding declines in the ratio in the rural, non-farm and farm areas kept to a national ratio virtually unchanged. So by 1960 to 1963, median non-white family income slipped at okay, it slipped. Okay, so from 55% to 53% from of the non of the white income. So the drop occurred in 3 regions. So with only the South, where a larger proportion of Negro families have more than one earner, showing a slight improvement. Okay, so basically they're pretty much setting up the stage, letting you know that if there's more than one income, that fosters the family. It keeps the safety net in terms of financial stability. And so they're saying 2 earners is better than 1, basically. But, times have changed. Things are different now. So this was in this times. But because in general terms, Negro families have the largest number of children, this was back then, and the lowest incomes, many Negro fathers literally cannot support their families. And so this basically lays out some of the reasons why a lot of these men left homes, is what they're saying is because they weren't able to support their families. But here's what they left out is why weren't they able to support their families? That is the question. Okay, so because the father is either not present, or he's unemployed, or he makes such a low wage. And a lot of it is the low wage and also discrimination because he can't get into other professions because of his color. So that is left out. So the Negro woman goes to work. And so it pretty much set the tone for how the Black family structure was going to be way back when. And so instead of blaming Black women for all of this, you have to blame the systems that were put in place for a lot of what has happened. A lot of what has happened to Black males and Black females alike. So 56% of Negro women ages 25 to 64 are the workforce against 42% of the white women. So this dependence on the mother's income undermines the position of the father and deprives the children of the kind of attention, particularly in school matters, which is now the standard feature of the middle class upbringing. So you hear that? And so it pretty much set the tone for what was going to happen and what was to come. And they pretty much put out a foundation that says that because no father is present, that's going to set the tone for how the kids are going to be raised up. And the family structure is broken down because now the Negro woman is the breadwinner, or the income earner and the sole income earner. So the dimensions grow. And so the dimensions of the problem of the Negro Americans are compounded by the present and extraordinary growth in the Negro population at the founding of the nation and into the first decade of the 19th century. 1 American in 5 was a Negro. So the proportion of the decline steadily until it was 1 in 10 by 1920. So where it held until 1950s when it began to rise. So since 1950, the Negro population has grown at a rate of 2.4% per year compared with 1.7% of total population. So if this rate continues in a 7 years, one American in every 8 will be non-white. So these changes, so that was also very threatening even back then, learning that 1 in 8 persons could be non-white. So, they had to list that there. So these changes are a result of a declining, listen to the tone, of a declining Negro death rate, now approaching that of the nation generally, and the fertility rate that grew steadily during the post-war period. So in 1959, the ratio of white to non-white fertility rates reached the ratio of 1 to 1 and 42.42. So both the white and non-white fertility rates have declined since 1959. Okay, the white and the non-white. Okay. But the differentials has not narrowed. So family size increased among non-white families between 1950 to 1960 as much as those without fathers, and as those with fathers, average family size changed little among white families, with a slight increase in the size of the husband-wife families, balanced by a decline in the size of families without fathers. So the Negro woman not only has more children, but has them earlier. So they had to lay that out for you as well. So this in 1960, there were 1,247 children ever born per thousand ever married non-white women, 15 to 19 years of age, as against only 725 among white women. The ratio at 1.7 to 1. And so the Negro fertility rate overall is now 1.4 times the white. But what might be called as the generation rate of 1.7 times the white. So this population growth must inevitably lead to an unconcealed crisis in the Negro unemployment. And so the most conspicuous failure of the American social system in the past 10 years has been its inadequacy to providing jobs for Negro youth. Thus, in January 1965, unemployment rate for Negro teenagers stood at 29%. And this problem will now become steadily more serious. So during the rest of the 1960s, the non-white civilization population 14 years of age and over will increase to 20% and more than double in white rate. Okay, so the non-white labor force will correspondingly increase 20% in the next 6 years and double the rate of that increase in the non-white labor force in the past decade. So as with the population as a whole, there is much evidence that the children are being born most rapidly in the Negro families with the least financial resources. So this is an ancient pattern. You hear that? So, but because the needs of the children are greater today, it is very possible that the education and opportunity gap between the offspring of these families and those of the stable middle class unions is not closing, but is growing wider. So a cycle is at work. And so, many children too early make it most difficult for the parents to finish school. So February of 1963, 38% of white girls dropped out of school, did so because of marriage and pregnancy, as against 49% of non-white girls. So 25, an Urban League study in New York reported that 44% of girl dropouts left school because of pregnancy in 2026. So low education levels in turn produce low income levels, which deprive children of many opportunities as well. And so the cycle repeats itself. And so that's a lengthy report. And I know you're going to like, dang, but these have been studies that have been done many, many generations ago and have pretty much laid out a foundation of a doomed life for people of color. And if you hear, the only thing that you can say and attest that is true is that unemployment rates have been one to cause. And also, it talks about how slavery was set up in a place to pretty much demonize people and put them in a subservient, or more than an underclass, not even subservient to that effect. And so they also have the backlash, which is on education next. And so here you'll see this old white guy, Moynihan, and the Single Parent Family, 1965 report and its backlash by James T. Patterson. And so this is a picture of Moynihan, or well, actually the guy that wrote the Moynihan report. His name is Daniel Patrick Moynihan. So I almost called him Moynihan, but that is his name. So he's pictured here in the Senate office building in 1994. And he served as a U.S. Senator from the New York between 1977 and 2001. And so that's him right there. And so he's the one that basically in the late 1964, Daniel Pat Moynihan was a largely unknown 37-year-old old assistant secretary of the labor of the administration, President Lyndon B. Johnson, a liberal Democrat who had been an aide to the governor of Harmon of New York in 1950s. Moynihan enthusiastically supported John F. Kennedy and a few Irish Catholics in 1960 with the help of friends, and he landed a low-level position of the Labor Department in 1961. So like many liberals, during the hopeful early 1960s, Moynihan cherished the can-do faith and the capacity of the experts' knowledge and governmental action and improve the quality of life. And so he was viewed as sort of like this modern guy, this guy that laid out, how he could improve the quality of life. And he put in these reports about the single black men, single black women, and the families that were led by single black women. And so Moynihan cherished that can-do faith, they claim. So having grown up in New York City in the broken family, his father left when Pat was 10 years old. And he believed, as did many Catholic thinkers, that solid families were the basic institution of social organization. And so his belief system was a lot different back then, because even now some people will still believe that family structure plays a part in the role of what's come for families to thrive and for children to thrive and later in life. And so, but there's a lot of pertinent information that sometimes I feel is left out of some of these theologies. But it goes on to state that 1/3 of the nation have documented very high percentages of young black men in single parent families who failed mental and physical tests for the military draft. He laid that out in a report called the 1/3 of a nation. And so later that year, he and a Harvard sociologist, Nathan Glazer, published a well-received book, Beyond the Melting Pot, emphasized the staying power of the family, ethnic, racial, and religious identifications of American life. And so through Moynihan, it helped develop the LBJ's War on Poverty, which is the War on Poverty in 1964, and cheered enactment of historic Civil Rights Act. And so also in 1964, he thought that much of more had to be done to help Black Americans attain anything resembling socioeconomic equality with whites. So as he put it in a memo in the Willard Witz, then Secretary of Labor, in April of 1964, the Negroes are asking for unequal treatment. More seriously, it may be that without unequal treatment, there is no way for them to achieve anything like equal status in the long run. So with this idea in mind, one of that seemed to prefigure what was later called affirmative action, which a lot of people still fight over. He decided in December of 1964 to write a report about the low-income Black families in the United States, which I read to you about his statistical data, which is statistical aid from experts in the Labor Department. Moynihan was neither a sociologist nor a demographer, but he started his research on January 1st of 1965 and consulting scholars and civil rights activists as well. And so he also delved into major books concerned with African American history and contemporary race relations. And these works also included W.E.B. Du Bois, E. Franklin Frazier, Gunnar Gunnar Meredith and Kenneth Clark and others emphasized that a long history of white racism and savage American life. Savaged American life. And so those things you can say are very true. So they pretty much in those reports laid out the foundation of what was to come today. And so within that an amazing short span of 3 months, he completed a report called The Negro Family, the Case for the National Action, 78-page long and consisted of 48 pages of text backed by 61 footnotes. And so I probably read a condensed version, and an appendix of 24 pages of charts and tables with, statistics, which a lot of people will say, I need to see the facts. I need to see the statistics. But you got to be mindful that statistics sometimes can be cherry picked. And you got to also bring into account for the comparisons of other families and situations are different case by case. So in March of 1965, the Labor Department printed 100 copies of the work, which is now called the Moynihan Report. It aimed his in-house report at Johnson administration officials and not at the general public. But it feels as though it also lays out a framework of stereotypical situations that are set out to doom the family of Black people, people of color as a whole. So it did not divulge his name. So its title page carried the words "for official use only." So he left his name out of that, but we know he's the one that orchestrated. So Moynihan in 1966, this is him right here. He appeared before the Senate Government Operations Subcommittee during the hearings of urban problems. And so these are the people that were speaking for Black people on behalf of urban problems, quote unquote. And so, you got to know that a lot of this comes with some backlash. And so that's exactly what this article was stating, that but he was well read and he was convivial. He was a convivial man who had cultivated useful friendships in Washington. And in distributing his report, he fired off urgent memorandums to recipients. So one such message directed at LBJ, which is Lyndon B. Johnson, argued that equal an opportunity for Negroes was promised in War on Poverty and 1964 Civil Rights Act, and it does not produce equal results. And so he sort of was a fighter in one way, you could perceive him, but also people find this very stereotypical in some of these reports, and they are not very happy about it, and they find that it also laid out a foundation or a blueprint, painted a picture and a blueprint for the dooming of Black families as well. And so it also left out some pertinent information at how some of the systems in place played a role in this. He did mention slavery, he did mention Jim Crow, how it breaks down family structure, but also people found it sexist because they felt as though they had to include the male in the family structure. It left out, grandpa, uncles, cousins, things like that. You can't make people stay with you. And so a lot of people are sort of like in limbo. There's some people that agree with the reports and other people that are in opposition on how it was constructed. And two, by it being always someone that is not of color being the mouthpiece over what poverty and blight was in Black communities. So one such message, it says equal opportunities for Negroes as promised in the War on Poverty in 1964 Civil Rights Act does not produce equal results because Negroes today are grievously injured people who in fair and equal competition will by and large lose out. And so he reminded Johnson that you were born poor, but you were brought up poor, and yet you came of age full in ambition, energy, and ability because your father and mother gave it to you. See, so it's pretty much states that if there's no father in the home, that you're doomed. You're doomed. And white people had a chance, as to oppose the Black people didn't. And but the thing is that it doesn't lay out all. It has to bring out more of what structures in American societies are placed on the Black family. And so the richest inheritance of any child is a stable, loving, disciplined family life. Everybody's life is not always going to be stable and loving. And you have also white families that always don't have stable and loving family lives. And we see that. And so, but it kind of makes a comparison of the the best families to the worst situations, which actually some of those situations were perpetuated throughout some of the things dating back since slavery. So the Negro family featured an eye-catching prose. Much of the bold-faced and italics attributes maintained herein, supported by the wealth of clearly presented the accurate statistical data, and opened the dramatic statement, the U.S. in approaching new crisis in race relations. So American Negroes, he added, now have expectations that will go beyond civil rights, and they will now expect that the near future equal opportunities for them as a group will produce roughly equal results as compared to that of other groups. But Moynihan wrote that this is not going to happen. Not for Black people, it wouldn't. So nor will it happen for generations as well. So the blueprint is laid out even back then. So to come unless a new and special effort is made. So they had to put out a new and special plan to help Black folks back then. You think it worked? We're now in this time. What do you think happened? So what are we all fighting about? What do you see people talking about on social media? And people talking about they're gonna, we need to segregate. Some people are even talking about they want to segregate them. See what that did back then. So Moynihan explained why this would not happen. So first, the racist virus in American bloodstream still afflicts us. It still does today. And I'm saying that. So Negroes will encounter serious personal prejudice for at least another generation, many generations. So second, 3 centuries of sometimes unimaginable mistreatment have taken their toll on the Negro people. He emphasized that the circumstances of the Negro American community in recent years has probably been getting worse, not even better at all. So offering this data concerning Black poverty, unemployment, crime, juvenile delinquency, narcotic use, and serious educational disadvantage, Moynihan maintained the deep roots of the crisis and lay in American slavery is where it came from, and white families in the 20th, that racism, mass migrations, and urbanization of the Black population. He added further disorganized Black families in the 20th century. And so he pointed out that the Negroes were managing to move into a middle class, but he focused on documenting that he argued was deteriorating situations of impoverished Black families in the inner cities. And so the family structure of the lower class of Negroes is highly unstable, and in many urban centers or cities, that is approaching complete breakdown, which where are we today? And so this was the fundamental source of the weakness of the Negro community at the present time. And so here was his diagnosis, which was here. Moynihan, the man of his time, believed that the fathers must ordinarily be the breadwinners. And so that's where the sexism comes in. Some people don't like hearing this because they feel like it's a sexist view of looking at this situation. But see, you gotta remember this was back in that time where most of the family structure was a male-female, and the man was the breadwinner. So it says ordinarily the male's supposed to be the breadwinner in American families, and he had much to say about illegitimacy, and the word generally used in the time to identify out of wedlock pregnancy. So the percentage of white births in the U.S. was illegitimate, and he said that it inched upward to 2% in 1940 to 3% in 1963, but Black percentages, however, had jumped more. So in these years, it was 16.8% to 23.6%, so it was a lot more, thereby remaining roughly 8 times higher than among whites. So Black divorce rates, too, had also increased in 1940. These had been the same for Blacks and whites, but in 1964, non-white people, here as elsewhere, he meant Negro percentage had become 40% higher than that among whites. So the result, he wrote, was that almost 1/4 of the Negro families are headed by females. And so an incredible mistreatment of the overpast 3 centuries. Moynihan continued, had forced Negro families in the U.S. into the matriarchal structure, and this was not necessarily a bad thing, he added. But because such of a structure is so out of line the rest of the American science society, he wrote in his report that seriously retards progress of the group as a whole. And so it imposes a crushing burden on the Negro male and in consequence on the great many Negro women as well. And so many in American society presume the male leadership in the private and public affairs, a subculture such as the Negro American, in which this is not the pattern, it's placed at a distinct disadvantage. So a consequence of these trends, Moynihan emphasized startling increase in welfare dependency. And so among American Negroes, largely because of broken families, he wrote 56% of the non-white children received means-tested public assistance at some time in their lives under a nation of AFDC programs, which is aid to families and dependent children. And so, which mainly assisted female-headed families. By contrast, this figure was 9% among white children. Stunned to discover that the number of new AFDC cases opened to non-whites was increasing, even the non-white male unemployment rates in the prosperous early 1960s were slowly decreasing. He speculated that something deeper in the economic hardship alone was the beginning of the damaged lower class Black families, which were falling apart even as the overall economy was exhibiting vibrant growth. And so it's sort of put here in Moynihan report that in 1964, almost 1/4 of the Black families were headed by females. And so, in looking and viewing this picture, it's demonizing the Black women as well, to say it must be something she did wrong to run the guys away, or something like that. But then he does list out unemployment was one of the biggest factors, and divorce was expensive at the time, so he'd rather just separate or he would desert the family. And so he did place that as the big factor as to why a lot of these women were by themselves, which what do we have going on today? And so, especially when we have men who have a problem with infidelity. And so it goes on to say that for all these reasons of tangle pathology, the heading of the longest chapter of the tightening over the lower class Black Americans, most Negro youth, he wrote, are in danger of being caught up in it. So many of these who escape due for one generation only as things now are, their children may have to run for the gauntlet all over again. So this was a frightening situation that may indeed have begun to feed on itself, and that was capable of perpetuating itself without assistance from the white world. What was to be done? Moynihan, believing that the pathologies troubling Black families were deep, interrelated, and complicated, privately favored a range of solutions, including greater access to birth control. And so this is where they get into this birth control. So they were trying to stop Black women from having babies and producing, reproducing, because the men weren't staying. Generously, family allowances such as those available to Western European democracies, and mainly for males, substantial public works programs. But he also recommended military service was a way where there was an utterly masculine world, okay, for young Black men to thrive in. So they would promote men going into the military. We know what happened with that, don't we? Some of us do. So it was clear from the report that he agonized most about the effects of the job discrimination. He did mention that, and unemployment of young Black males, which, except during the World War II, the Korean War years, had been at disaster levels for 35 years. So a brief closing of the section titled "The Case for National Action" showed that he hoped for a vigorous federal response. In boldface, he concluded the policy of the U.S. to bring the Negro American to full and equal sharing and responsibility rewards of citizenship. So to this end, the programs of the federal government bearing on the objective shall be designed to have effect directly or indirectly of enhancing the stability of resources to the Negro American family. So where are we now today? What do you think has happened to the Negro family? What are we talking about in some of these blogs and some of the things to talk about? So, but the report was a diagnostic, not a blueprint for the cure, but they set it up as such. And so, seeking the stimulant for the formation of the carefully planned and well-informed governmental policies, Moynihan did not provide a wish list of proposed solutions. So the hope, and here's Dr. Martin Luther King and President Lyndon B. Johnson. They meet for the civil, where he meets with the civil rights leader in 1965. So hope, the key officials and males are the one that are doing the talking. There's no females involvement in this. Rarely, if any, at all. The only female involvement is you see females are being pretty much studied as to being female-led families and what demise comes thereafter. So the key officials in the Johnson administration reenacted enthusiastically to the report. Labor Secretary Wirtz relayed a Moynihan memo in LBJ, in which he wrote the attached memorandum in 9 pages of dynamite about the Negro situation. Whether Johnson read the report is unknown, if he actually read it, but he was clearly aware of its thrust and of the excitement it had evoked among advisors. So he soon asked Moynihan to help write a major speech on the subject to be delivered at the graduation ceremonies at Howard University, a Black institution, in the early June. And so the speech that Moynihan quickly co-wrote with the presidential speechwriter Richard Godwin hailed the strides towards freedom and the recent civil rights legislation was accelerating. But Johnson continued, freedom is not enough. And he explained, you do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him and bring him up to a startling line of a race and then say you are free to compete with all the others and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. So thus, it is enough to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. And we seek not justice, but opportunity, and not just legal equity, but human ability, and not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and as a result. And so while Johnson did not specify the government what they ought to do, he promised to take action to improve Black education, healthcare, employment, and housing. Some of the things that we talk about today that you hear people talking about, we need this, we need that, they did this way back then. So especially to devise the social programs better designed to hold families together. So the family, he emphasized, is a cornerstone of our society. So he announced that he would convene a White House conference. You see that? So in the fall of featuring scholars and experts and outstanding Negro leaders, men of both races, men, do you hear that? So officials of the government at every level. And the theme and the title of the conference would be to fulfill these rights. So civil rights leader Hale Johnson's address, Martin Luther King Jr. declared, never before has the president articulated the depths of the dimensions of the problems more eloquently and profoundly. Johnson himself later said, and rightly so, that this was the greatest civil rights speech. And so what was the fallout? There was ample reason that at the time for Johnson and Moynihan to hope for the public, or that hope for the public because of the powerful tide of American liberalism, was the cresting at an unprecedented high level. By June of 1965, a heavily Democratic Congress had either enacted or was about to enact a host of ambitious Great Society programs: elementary, secondary education, and Medicare, Medicaid, and voting rights reform, of racist immigration laws. This was happening back then. Isn't this the same thing that we're talking about now, today, in 2018, almost 2019, that Johnson, a relentless advocate, had been urging upon it? So historic developments in the pivotal summer of 1965, however, transformed the political climate in the U.S., thereby deeply darkening the context in which the report was to enter the public realm. So one of the erroneous or enormous, actually, military escalations publicly announced in late July of the nation's involvement in Vietnam. This absorbed Johnson's attention, diverted massive federal funds to the war effort, and unleashed increasingly furious political acrimony. A little later in the early August, 5 days of violent and widely televised Black demonstrations ravaged the Watts area of Los Angeles. Militant Black leaders, realizing that they had failed, recognized the extent of the Negro rage in the cities, hastened make amends by demanding far-reaching reforms. So these are what caused a lot of these riots to come about, because even back then, when they had did these roundtable talks, they didn't make it inclusive of the community. They just talked about the community's plight. And so they claimed as though they were going to put a plan in action, but things never really did go down to the advantage of people, so that they can further their financial stability, their family structures, and their homes, and their plight in society. So many Americans, however, were shocked and appalled by the turbulence. The Bloody Watts riot is what it was called. As it was called, was a disaster for the interracial, nonviolent civil rights movement, for the liberal hopes in general. So even these developments were threatening liberal aspirations. Passages from the report, which had remained in-house until then, were being leaked, whereupon it became known publicly that the Moynihan report, the early press accounts accurately described the document, or as they read it, the well-intentioned liberal effort to promote intra-administration discussions of a serious social issue. So this was August of 1965, 5 days of violent rioting, widely televised Black demonstrations ravaged the Watts area of Los Angeles. And this is here, you see it. And it was probably martial law that was called in eventually. So by September, however, the firestorm of controversy had began to explode. Some commenters, alarmed, discovered that the number of conservatives and mainstream journalists were interpreting the report as indicating that the need for racial self-help, worried that it would lead to people to blame the victim, such as what I'm saying, that it points out the people that are going through these problems and the symptoms that are occurring from a larger problem that has been going on, which stems of racism and structures that are put in place that pretty much demonize people of color. So otherwise seized upon Moynihan's dramatic phases, notable tangle of pathology, accused him of painting a poisonous negative picture of Black culture, while at the same time failing to prescribe antidotes. So much is what I'm saying in short. So a few angry writers branded him as a racist. So James Farmer, head of the Congress of Racial Equality, later denounced the report as a massive cop-out for the white consciousness or conscience. He added, "We are sick unto death of being analyzed, mesmerized, bought, sold, and slobbered over, while the same evils that are the ingredient of our oppression go unattended." And so that's pretty much the backlash of that report, of how people felt once they had read it and they got their hands on it. And so comments such as Farmer's were unfair. Moynihan obviously empathized with the Black poor, they claim, but it has his bad luck that parts of the report became public to such a tempestuous post-Watts time in the modern history of American race relations. It was obvious that he should have thought twice before employing such high-octane phrases as tangible of pathology. Black writers like Kenneth Clark, who had detailed Black pathology in his recently published book, Dark Ghetto, might be extolled for detailing Black social problems. But the white man who has highlighted the rise of Black illegitimacy and the pathologies would not not be. Moynihan, a white messenger of unpleasant news, was vulnerable, a figure who would be disarmed and shot at. So President Johnson hoped to avoid a break with increasing militant Black leaders and quickly distance himself from the report. So he didn't want to be a part of it when he learned of the backlash and how people perceive this report to be very stereotypical and very visceral at labeling out the demise of Black people. And pretty much it was like looking at a blueprint. And so President Johnson, he had hoped to avoid a break in with increasing militant Black leaders at the time and quickly distance himself from that report. So he announced that the promise of White House conference would be a smaller affair in November and would concern itself with only planning a larger meeting to take place in the mid 1966. And so by that time, the civil rights movement was falling into a disarray, and the conference packed by LBJ with loyalists accomplished nothing. These are educated people back in the time who were doing the same things that people are talking about now, and it accomplished nothing. So Moynihan, as it happened, left the Johnson administration in July of 1965 to run unsuccessfully for the presidency of New York City Council, and he was thus in no position to act as an official spokesman for his report. But he was deeply hurt by LBJ that had appeared to abandon that report, and that he was not even invited to attend the November meeting at that time. So the administration, he wrote later, had promptly disassociated itself with the whole issue altogether. So he added a vacuum, then developed that no Black would go near the subject at all. And so until one did, no white man could do so without incurring the wrath of a community grown rather too accustomed to the epithets. So he complained privately to a friend in the late 1965. In my head were sticking on a pike at a southwest gate to the White House grounds, the impression would hardly be greater. So critics who charged him with blaming the victim especially infuriated him when the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr wrote to assure him that the report was terrifyingly accurate. Study of the disintegration of the Negro family. He replied to Miss Niebuhr, saying that the whole affair has become a nightmare of misunderstanding, misinterpretation, and misstatement. So some people, psychologist Kenneth Clark, a leader of civil rights movement, he's here, pictured here. He was deplored on the attacks of the Moynihan report. And so some Black people agreed with the Moynihan report, okay, in contrast to some that didn't. And so you got some of those same people who pretty much coined the Black family through that Moynihan report. And so one such person, later he wrote, in far from blaming the victim, he could accuse of the almost misstating evidence in order to avoid the implication of blame. Kenneth Clark was another who deplored attacks on the report. Okay, he said of its critics, it's kind of a wolf pack operating a very undignified in an undignified way. If Pat is a racist, I am. So in other words, he says he's a Black man, but he's agreeing with Moynihan, his report. So he highlights the total pattern of segregation and discrimination as a doctor responsible for the disease simply because he diagnoses it. That's his theory. You know, he's claiming that he diagnosed the disease, and so, you know, is he responsible for disease because he diagnosed it? So, you know, that's his euphemism to Moynihan's report. So Moynihan thanked Clark for that input as a friend and standing by him, and mused, in moments of fury, I sometimes think that we are about to repeat the tragedy of Reconstruction, liberty without equality. And so You'd have to pick apart the report to see that there's some truthisms in it, but it also leaves out some stark realities of some of the things that pretty much paint that blueprint to be very stereotypical, and there's sexism in it, and you can pull apart some of the things that back in that time. You have to also realize that that was a time where they viewed a family structure as the male, female, and male-led families rather than the female-led families. And so you also have a group of males that are doing these reports. You don't have female input at all whatsoever. And so a lot of people are not in total agreement with these reports as well, because of the way it lays out a system, but it doesn't, it lays out the symptoms of the systems of what have been put in place, but it doesn't make light of all of the system or the structures that are put in place. It did mention the slavery, did mention the Jim Crow and the breakdown of the male, but what about females? It made it seem as though females were able to thrive as long as they were able to take care of the babies and they were able to receive AFDC. They could lead the households as if women didn't have problems. And so you have to look at all of that as a whole. And so the question remains that Moynihan went on to become a professor at Harvard University and hold high offices in Republican administrations of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, and served the Democratic Senate as a Democratic senator of New York between 1977 and 2001. So as a prolific writer and renowned public intellectual, he frequently explored trends in American race relations and family life, hailing for instance of controversial report Equality and Education Opportunities in 1966 by his friend James Coleman, which stressed the relationship between broken families and poor student performance in public schools. But criticism of his report continued to appear from time to time and again in the 1970s thereafter from feminists who assailed what they regarded as his report as patriarchal families instead of matriarchal families. Still hurt he distanced himself from the left-oriented figures. And so, as it said, he went on to be a Republican or he held offices in Republican administration. And so a lot of Republicans pretty much would love these reports. They stand by this kind of stuff. And so still he distanced himself from left-oriented figures. So in 1965, when the community action programs with the war on poverty encountered subsequent problems, he toned down his once strong faith of governmental expertise, emphasizing that some great society liberals had lost a sense of limits. So though he continued to call himself a liberal and a Democrat, he associated closely with neoconservatives and writers such as Glazer James Wilson and Irving Kristol. So you have to take into account when they do stuff like that. They call themselves a liberal, think about that, and a Democrat, but they still side with people who are neoconservatives. So their thought process is going to be a slightly different. So they're not completely to the left. They're like in the middle, leaning sort of to the right in terms of politics. So then later, he also deplored post-1965 trends afflicting American race relations and family life. And so at most times since the mid-1970s, Black male unemployment has been roughly twice as high as white male unemployment are among white men, and the Black poverty rate has been roughly 3 times higher. Drug-related arrests have contributed to staggeringly high growth in numbers of incarcerated males. And so, what did he leave out in that? Black males being arrested by the police. Okay, I'll let you figure that out. So most of African American children, especially those in low-income single-parent families, enter the first grade with already large cognitive disadvantages, and so which then grow into higher grades. So from what I've witnessed in the world of teaching and in the world of education, a lot of times they quickly will label some Black kids as, because of culture and cultural differences, rather than looking at it as that. If you're, oh, he's too loud, or he's too disruptive, or he's speaking out of turn, or, that's not the way you say it. And then you have an IEP that set up individual education plan, and now this kid is already being pushed into special education, and therefore special education, if that doesn't work, if he has any outbursts, then they have a maybe a laundry list on him, and maybe not even that. And then what is it called? Prison to pipeline, prison to pipeline, school to prison pipeline. And so thanks in considerable part to the powerful cultural trends which have featured ever more insistence, popular demands for personal freedom, marriage rates have in the 1960s have been tumbled. Percentages of births that are out of wedlock have escalated throughout much of the economical development Western world. So among non-Hispanics, African Americans, percentages have jumped to 23.6%. And so among Moynihan, they had identified that 1963, more than 70% has stayed since the mid 1990s. So the rate among whites, 3% in 1963, has reached to 30%. And among overall, 41% of births today in the U.S. are out of wedlock. And so in the 1970s to 1980s, so we're getting closer to our time, as the trends that arose widespread commentary. Conservative writers such as Charles Murray blame public welfare programs and undermining Black families' life in the U.S. Other conservatives since the 1980s misreading Moynihan's message, they claim, have cited his report as evidence to support cutbacks in social spending and to call for the moral revitalization of Black culture. So there has been some truth in the report. But the thing is that what comes off as a denigrate to the Black community is that it needs to list out more of what these social structures that are in place that have caused a lot of these symptoms to occur, to result in some of these problems. But it also makes mention of the Black woman being the single leader of the family, and meaning that a family cannot thrive unless it's patriarchal. And that sounds sexist. And so Moynihan disagreed sharply with such conservative views, pointing out that he had done in his report that welfare spending was a necessary response to a need, not a source of dependency. And so that is true, but it has caused some problems, because if you're rejected from jobs, if you're discriminated from jobs and from housing and from certain systems that are for certain society, you are dependent almost for life on these programs. So the rejecting of the notion, I'm adding that in there, that he had blamed the victim, okay? So moreover, he did as much as anyone in public life in 1965 to develop policies that aimed at strengthening families, white as well as the Black. But during the Nixon years, he championed the Family Assistance Program, which was called FAP, which enacted would have provided a guaranteed annual income to many poor people. As a senator, he promoted liberal social ideas, including family allowances, what poor families needed most of all from government. And he often argued was more income and not more services. Okay. And so more income, not more services, which if you have a system in place that won't hire Black men or Black women, or if they look at your name on an application and they throw it out, what are you to do then? And so that doesn't change the people's mindsets either. So he also emerged as a leading proponent of the federal tax credit and low-income families who send their families to private schools. So with the passage of time, a few Black spokespeople, liberals, also among them, began to speak out for the ideas of the Moynihan Report as well, such in the mid-1980s, and have notably included William Julius Wilson, activist Eleanor Holmes Norton, and the audacity of hope. President Barack Obama complained that some liberals, policymakers, and civil rights leaders had erred when in their urgency to avoid blaming the victims of historical racism. They tended to downplay and ignore the evidence of entrenched behavioral patterns among Black poor, and really were contributing to the intergenerational poverty. And so this is called in the audacity of hope. President Barack Obama complained that some liberal policymakers and civil rights leaders had erred when In their urgency to avoid blaming the victim of historical racism, they tended to downplay and ignore evidence. Okay. And so, as a statement such Obama's intricate, most commentators today appear to believe that the Moynihan was right in 1965 and his attackers had been unfair. So some people had hailed him as a prophet, but not even Moynihan had imagined in 1965 that the growth of percentages of out of wedlock births would become so enormous. And then later he was emphasized that the problems affecting families were extraordinarily complex and that there were no easy answers, which is a reason why he had not enumerated cures in his report. And so that's what people really did not like. He had no solution. It was basically listing out the demise of the Black family and all of these different foundings and these assessments, and it's pretty much laying out a blueprint of the demise of what's going to come because of the poverty in these communities. Didn't list out all of the different obstacles that caused all of it. It just pointed to the slavery and to the Jim Crow and to some obvious issues of unemployment, but it also did not cast light of some of the policies that were put in place that were created to keep people out of opportunities as well. And so it also didn't bring about solutions to these issues. So that was deemed as very, very problematic to people. Rather than solving a problem, you're laying out the floor plan of what problems are existing and not helping anything. And so in 1992, he wrote to Hillary Clinton that serious study of the family was the most important issues of the social policy, but added, I picked up the early tremors and have followed the subject for 30 years now, but haven't the faintest notion as to what realistically can be done. So in 2002, a year before Moynihan had died, he was the keynote speaker at a conference and experts concerning international trends affecting family life. So his message was pessimistic, and cohabitation, he pointed out, was neither stable nor long-term. And the rise of fatherless families, deeply disadvantaged children, is still remain risky for white writers to highlight Black family problems. And social science seemed unable to develop a national family policy. So we are now here near the generational or general theory of family change, he asserted, and there we shall leave it. The question still stands, who indeed can tell us what happened to the American family? And so that's pretty much the article in and of itself. So I wanted to lay these out. I had this on my mind. I know this seems pretty wordy and it's pretty lengthy, but I feel like you always got to know what happened in the past and what shapes the future. And people say, oh, that's in the past. That's not good. Don't think about the past. Well, the past really does affect how people perceive one another in the future and what's to come. And so a lot of times, some of these things you can take out of the report and you can say, yeah, that's true. That is happening. Okay, what are the solutions for the problems that we're facing? And so, like we've had many protests and many people who have had backlash on a lot of issues that have occurred, instead of blaming Black women for the demise of the Black community, he lists out all of the problems, but he also, that's another thing that was in upheaval, is looking at the single mother-led families. It lists out as if that's what did it. And so I feel like a lot of these people that make these negative videos towards Black women and look down on Black women blame the Black women because of things like this. And it's sexist. The other thing is that all of these conversations were male-led, and they had no input, no female input as to why some of these problems occurred as well, and what problems that the woman had in her life. You know, raising children alone is not easy. And so it's not like she woke up one day and said, I want to be a single mother and have a child out of wedlock either. And so they don't look at that. They don't look at the plight of the mother and what she goes through and what her going to work and having to try to go to school, and then having, and even today in this time, what goes on. And so I feel that this is very problematic. It brings a consistency of a discussion where you want to talk about it, but you also want to list out some truthisms and some things that were relevant and some things that weren't included in these assessments. And the fact that you have a white man making an analysis of a black family structure is also a thing that people find problematic, because his view on life and the way he sees it through his lens might be altogether different. Which some people retort from that and say, well, he was trying to help. He was trying to make an assessment. He was trying to list out all the problems that could occur or that would occur if they don't change things. But at what extent? There were really no solutions in this report. It was basically listing out all of the symptoms of what happened, of the social structure of American society, and the history of racism has laid out to Black people as a whole. And so when we see these discussions, when you hear like all of these YouTubers like Yvette Carnell, and she's writing stuff on her board, and she's saying that we need to, we're DOS and we're poor and all this. A lot of these people that came way before, you have other people who have scholarly thought, and they're not saying to you that there are a lot of people who really, they went to college and they have all these highfalutin degrees. They're professors at Harvard, have done all that, been there, done that, but they never have a solution to any of these problems. Why? Because we still have that virus, as he talked about, racism in American society. They've never made atonement for all of the problems that they have pretty much set up for people of color. They've never apologized. And if they had, they never really apologized. Apologies should not just come with words, it's come with action. And so that's the problem. They set up systems so that you can have temporary assistance, but never long-term stability for your family so you can thrive on. Every program that was set up so that you could get ahead, they have someone that comes and is oppositional about it. They didn't want affirmative action. You even have programs now or schools now that are fighting in court. They're not Black people. They're people of color, though, I would consider, or they're Asian, the Asian population, where they want to go to Harvard and then they're being discriminated for the basis of the fact that they're trying to have a certain number or fill a quota of who can be in there and to make the school look good based on testing numbers and whatnot. So you have all kind of things in place. Also, some of the HBCUs, you have those schools and versus the ones that are private, and then some of those schools are private, and then some of the schools that are public, and then what you can and cannot say, what these learning institutions teach you. Are they schools of liberals, schools of Democrats, or schools of Republican learning? And so, are they co-ed political schools? Are they schools where they're going to foster you in terms of trade? Are there schools where they're going to build you a foundation so you can start and making a career and becoming an engineer, a doctor, or a lawyer, and what have you? Are they schools where you can compete in the political arena and become elected officials so that you can make laws that can change situations in the Black community to make things better, so that there be room for solution for these problems instead of just blueprint reports or reports that list out some of the economic disadvantage, societal problems that have plagued Black communities for many, many generations, even up to now. And so that's the way I look at it. I know it seems like I said a lot, but that's my take on it. I put in my opinions on it. I am going to say this. I have to give him credit for laying out a report and having statistics. But then again, with statistics, you have to realize that a lot of those statistics, where are they coming from, and what place and time and the generation that was happening back then and what was going on then. Some of it is a little bit different now. We have different new ideas new theories, new things that are happening in society now, a different change in family structure. We have what is called blended families, interracial families, a lot of different things that have changed from that time, that point on. And so, too, you also have families. When you say blended families, you have to include that there's an uncle, there's a cousin, there's a brother. There are men in the family. They may not be intimately linked to the woman. They could be related to the woman, or they could be neighbors. You know, it takes a village, they claim, which is true, I believe. But we don't have that structure in place as we did before, because now you have a lot of people who don't really trust the village, because you have a lot of crime and a lot of things that people are worried about, and molestation and things that are happening in religious arenas now that make people don't even want to go to church anymore, because you're afraid you're going to get killed, or you're afraid that maybe the clergyman is raping your kid, or has raped you. And so you foster a lot of resentment towards that, which that's the second home, I would say, or it was looked at or viewed as such, in terms of raising your family, and then school. And so, two, you have to also bring out the importance that some of these people, what is it in their research? What are they trying to accomplish? Are they really trying to make things better? Or are they just basically laying out a floor plan or a blueprint of the demise of a culture of people, without regard to solution of these issues? And even at the end of all of this, the diagnosis, there really is, there's a diagnosis, but there's no cure for it. And so you also have to bring about the importance that if you have the white class, what is the cure for racism? If they are so powerful in this country and they set up the social structures and norms of the country that is being led today by a white class of people, then what is the cure for that? Because if there's a cure for it, then maybe that would be the cure for these problems in the Black community as a whole. And so with that being said, I'm going to leave this video a go. This is very lengthy. This is probably one of my longest videos yet. So I just thought I would put my input in that. That's probably my heartfelt evaluation of this. So with that being said, give your thought and feedback on what you feel about this. Some people maybe remember this. Maybe this is going way too far back, but it really does paint a bleak picture of the single parent led families, and but it doesn't give very much solution to this. And a lot of people are opposed to these reports. Even today, you'll have people that are strategists who some agree with this and some do not. And so I just want to show you this picture here. I don't know if I can blow it up. It says education next. This might have been, I don't know if you can see it. To my right, you'll see a Black female with a child, and she's by herself. And it says today's American family. And so sometimes people will see those pictures and that is viewed as very negative. And so even, you know, in some ads, you'll see some ads where they'll show other people where they have the man and the woman and the child. And then when you see the Black woman with in an ad, it's just her and the baby. And so it's almost like it's a what you call, I would say, a self-fulfilling prophecy that they've laid out as a blueprint for the destruction of Black communities and families structure, that there is no family structure in place, that it has been pretty much dismantled. And so with no solution to be had and no plan in place, which they claim they had different plans, you know, a lot of people are very offended by this, as is too, you have on the contrary people who look at this and they say, oh yeah, that's what happened. Yeah, that's the reason why this happened. And so they all point to the Black female as the one that they pretty much look at as the fault of why this happened, when it really isn't the Black female's fault. She's also going through something. And what I dislike, I'm going to go, is that they laid out as if Black females didn't have any history of problems and discrimination as did Black males. And it to much to not my surprise at all, today it's the same thing, where when you look at um, the killings of black males, and if there's killings of black females, you don't see any buttons, you don't see any flyers looking for black females, and you don't see anybody saying anything in regard to black females' plight and them being murdered by cops and what have you. Rarely. It's not enough. It's usually always there's black males being gunned down by the police, and we need to rally cry around them. Yet you have some of those a few of them, who didn't even have any respect for the black woman and had a past or a history where they would put on Facebook and on social media at every given moment their disdain and their resentment towards black females. And so this is a thing that people don't look at as well. And I find that very counterproductive when you have reports like these, especially in this times. But we're back in that time. What do you think was going on in the heads of people when they were shut out of opportunities and shut out of education, shut out of housing, and placed in the ghettos and slums? And they couldn't, they had redlining. You didn't hear anything about that. They had job discrimination, and they had where even if you go apply for certain jobs, you wouldn't get hired because you were what they call the Negro, or worse. You weren't looked at as being a human even. And so that may be the main thing. They need to do a report on that rather than report on black people as being the problem of the source of their demise. With that being said, I'm going to let this video go. Thanks for listening.